A millionaire, amid laughter and provocations, launched a cruel challenge to a simple cleaning lady. "If you play that guitar, I'll marry you!" What seemed like just a tasteless joke ended up becoming an unexpected moment of revelation, emotion, and truth. When she placed her fingers on the strings, no one could imagine what was about to happen. Prepare yourself for a story of dignity, overcoming, and courage that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like on this video, and comment where you're watching from. Sometimes, the deepest sound is born from the most painful silence. The ballroom of the Grand Imperial Hotel had always been a place where light danced differently. Even when empty, the crystal chandeliers seemed to guard the reflections of all the gala nights, all the secrets whispered between champagne glasses, all the promises made and broken under their watchful brilliance. It was a place where dreams and illusions mixed like ingredients in an expensive cocktail, sweet at the beginning, bitter at the end, and always intoxicating. It was in this same ballroom that Clara Mendes, at 28 years old, learned to become invisible. Not a magical invisibility, but the kind that people like her, uniformed, silent, efficient, achieved in high society environments. It was a skill that protected and imprisoned her at the same time. It protected her from looks of disdain, invasive questions, malicious comments. But it imprisoned her in an existence where her value was measured only by the absence of errors, never by the presence of talents. That Thursday, Clara didn't know that the invisibility she had so carefully cultivated would be violently stripped away from her. She couldn't imagine that, between the dust she cleaned and the glasses she collected, she would find a way back to herself. A path marked by 6 strings tensioned over polished wood. The guitar that rested on the stage, waiting for the hired musician, seemed to call to her like an old friend who recognizes a familiar face in the crowd. And Clara, although trying to ignore it, felt her fingers tingling with memories she thought she had buried long ago. It was then that Eduardo Vasconcelos entered the ballroom, bringing with him that aura that only old money and new arrogance can create. The millionaire heir walked as if the world were a carpet laid exclusively for his feet, and smiled like someone who knows that his next joke, however bad it might be, would be celebrated as brilliance. Fate, that unpredictable screenwriter, crossed the paths of Clara and Eduardo that night, and with a simple collision, a stained glass, and a cruel bet, rewrote both their stories forever. The golden champagne splashed on Eduardo's Italian suit like small liquid stars. Clara felt her entire body freeze when she saw those drops spread across the impeccable lapel. Time seemed to slow down as the millionaire's eyes moved from the stained fabric to the cleaning lady's face. First came surprise, then indignation, and finally, the worst of all, cruel amusement. What carelessness. Eduardo's voice sounded louder than necessary, as if he wanted to ensure that all those present became witnesses to that moment. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" Clara felt the weight of all eyes upon her. Dozens of faces turned in her direction, some curious, others amused, all judging. The sound of conversations diminished, as if someone had turned down the volume of the ballroom. She tried to apologize, but the words got stuck in her throat. "Don't worry, dear," Eduardo continued, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't expect a cleaning lady to know the price of a good suit." Laughter echoed through the ballroom. Clara felt her face burn as she shrank her shoulders, as if she could shrink until she disappeared completely. But Eduardo wasn't satisfied. The taste of power, of public humiliation, was too sweet to abandon so soon. "By the way, let's liven up the evening," he said, pointing dramatically at the guitar on stage. "If you can play that guitar better than a professional, I'll marry you." The audience erupted in laughter. For them, it was just another spectacle, another form of entertainment on a predictable night. For Clara, it was something different. It was the moment when her past and present collided violently. She looked at the guitar on stage, feeling a familiar tingling in her fingertips. How long had it been since she last played? 8 years? 9? Since the accident? Since everything collapsed? She promised never at something. Perhaps just the accumulated fatigue of so many years of invisibility, stirred like an animal awakening after a long winter. "I accept," she said, with a voice that didn't seem like her own. The silence that followed was so dense it could be cut with a knife. The guests exchanged surprised looks. Eduardo raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the unexpected audacity. "Excellent," he exclaimed, raising the stained glass. "Get ready, everyone. Today we'll have a free show." The path to the stage seemed endless. Each of Clara's steps echoed on the marble floor as if announcing a sentence. Her knees trembled slightly under the simple uniform. She felt the weight of Eduardo's mocking gaze, the weight of the guests' malicious expectations, the weight of memories she had tried to suppress for so long. When she finally reached the guitar, something strange happened. The tremor in her hands diminished. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood of the instrument, recognizing the texture like someone reuniting with an old friend. The light scent of varnish and wood brought with it an avalanche of memories, from the conservatory, from the applause, from the theater, from her parents in the front row. She sat on the stool, adjusted the instrument in her lap like someone settling a sleeping child. The years of absence seemed to dissipate like mist under the morning sun. "What song do you want to hear?" she asked, looking Eduardo directly in the eye for the first time. He laughed, exchanging complicit glances with his friends. "Anything will do. Play Happy Birthday to You." More laughter ran through the ballroom like a cruel wave. Clara just nodded. She adjusted her position, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply. The world around her disappeared. For a moment, she was alone with the guitar. Her fingers found the strings by instinct, as if they had never been separated. The first note sounded clean and crystalline. The ballroom fell silent. It wasn't Happy Birthday. It was Bach, Prelude from Suite No. 1 for cello, adapted for guitar, a complex melody that flowed like pure water, each note precise and charged with emotion. The sound filled the space with an almost physical presence, touching each person present in a different way. Conversations ceased. Waiters stopped serving. Laughter died. Even Eduardo, who had started with a mocking smile, fell silent, watching with a confused expression. Clara's fingers danced over the strings with an intimacy that only exists between masters and their instruments. It was as if time hadn't passed, as if she had never abandoned music. Or perhaps, it was as if music had never abandoned her, just waited patiently for her to return. When the last note of the prelude faded in the air, Clara didn't stop. Without hesitation, she segued into another piece, Recuerdos de la Alhambra by Francisco Tárrega, a notoriously difficult composition that required impeccable tremolo technique. Her hands flew over the strings, extracting sounds that seemed impossible from a single instrument. "My God," a guest murmured, breaking the reverent silence. "She plays like a virtuoso." In the back of the ballroom, a middle-aged man approached, intrigued. It was Roberto Martins, a respected music critic, present at the party at a friend's invitation. His eyes didn't leave Clara's hands, analyzing each movement with growing admiration. Cell phones, previously ready to record humiliation, now captured something extraordinary. The hashtag #LikeCleaningLadyVirtuoso was already beginning to form, though no one in the ballroom knew it yet. Eduardo, uncomfortable, clenched his fists. What should have been an easy joke at the expense of an insignificant employee was becoming something completely different. He felt control of the situation slipping through his fingers like fine sand. Clara finished the second piece with a cascade of notes that sounded like distant thunder. The silence that followed lasted only a second before being broken by applause, first timid, then enthusiastic, until it became a standing ovation. Eduardo forced a smile, trying to disguise his discomfort. But Roberto Martins, the music critic, wouldn't let this opportunity pass. "Where did you study?" he asked, approaching the stage, fascinated. Clara hesitated. She hadn't talked about her past for years. But something had changed in her during those minutes. Music had awakened not only memories, but also courage. "National Conservatory," she replied with a clear voice. A murmur of astonishment ran through the ballroom. Some older guests began exchanging looks of recognition. "It's Clara Mendes," exclaimed an elegant lady with gray hair and impeccable posture. "She played at the Municipal Theater 8 years ago. Then she disappeared." All gazes converged on Clara, now with a different curiosity, more respectful. The past she had tried so hard to bury was back, exposed before everyone. It was then that a firm voice emerged from the crowd. Donna Elena, an old hotel housekeeper, who had worked there for more than 20 years and knew every corner of that place like she knew the lines of her own hand. "She lost her parents in an accident," the woman said, with a choked voice. "She sold everything to pay debts." The guitar reminded her of too much pain. A murmur of compassion ran through the room. Eduardo swallowed hard. The game had turned completely against him. What had started as a cruel joke was becoming a public relations nightmare. "But you promised, Eduardo," Roberto, the music critic, prodded with a malicious gleam in his eyes. "You said you'd marry her if she played better than a professional." "She is a professional," completed the lady who had recognized her. The audience began to pressure him. Eduardo was sweating, looking for a way out of this impossible situation. His gaze met Clara's, and for the first time he saw something beyond the uniform. He saw a complete person, with history, talent, pain, and dignity. Clara remained firm on stage, with the guitar still in her arms, like both a shield and a weapon. There was a new light in her eyes, a gleam of self-determination that wasn't there before. "I don't want your money or your marriage promise," she said, looking Eduardo directly in the eyes. "I just want respect!" The ballroom applauded again. Eduardo tried to respond, but realized that dozens of cell phones were already broadcasting live. The scene was going viral on social media. Hashtags like "Cleaning Lady Virtuoso" and "Millionaire Promise" were quickly climbing the trending topics. Desperate to contain the damage, Eduardo suggested, "Let's talk privately. In the private office?" Away from curious gazes and pointed cell phones, Eduardo dropped the mask of confident and charming host. He paced back and forth, running his hands through his perfectly combed hair, now disheveled by worry. "You don't understand," he said, almost pleading. "My reputation is at stake. Investors, boards of directors, partnerships. Everything depends on my public image." Clara watched him calmly. Something had changed inside her. It was as if, by playing again, she had recovered not only music, but also her own voice. "What's at stake is your humanity," she replied, interrupting him. "You called me invisible, but you discovered that every person carries a world within them." Eduardo stopped walking, astonished by the response. He wasn't used to being confronted that way, especially by someone he had considered insignificant hours before. "What do you want, after all?" he asked, defeated. Clara considered the question for a moment. What did she want? The answer came with the clarity of a perfectly executed musical note. "I want to return to music," she said with conviction. "Help sponsor accessible concerts. I'll teach people to play. You learn to look beyond your own ego." Eduardo stared at her, mouth agape. Of all the possibilities, money, fame, revenge, she had chosen something completely unexpected. Something that, for the first time that night, made him feel a hint of genuine respect. "That's an agreement?" he asked, confused. Clara smiled. A different smile from those she used to give hotel guests. A true smile that reached her eyes. "It's a new beginning." When they returned to the ballroom, guests waited anxiously. The murmur ceased when Clara got back on stage. The guitar waited for her, like a faithful old friend. "Tonight isn't about bets," she said with a firm voice to the attentive audience. "It's about remembering that every life has value, every story deserves to be heard." Sincere applause echoed through the ballroom. Eduardo, with no way out, confirmed the agreement before everyone. The public cheered at the unexpected turn. The night that had started as just another high society party had transformed into something meaningful, something that all those present would remember for a long time. Clara picked up the guitar again, adjusting it in her lap with the familiarity of someone reuniting with a piece of themselves. "To second chances," she said, before beginning to play. The first notes were born like raindrops after a long drought, delicate, precise, invigorating. Then they grew in intensity, like a beneficial storm that cleans the air and renews the earth. An original melody, inspired by that night, by that moment of transformation, brave and delicate. The strings echoed like a promise. Dignity has no uniform, and music, like life, always finds a way to be heard. If this story is already moving you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any of the upcoming ones. Here there are always stories that move, inspire, and surprise. 6 months had passed since the night that changed everything. The ballroom of the Grand Imperial Hotel was different. It wasn't just the new curtains or the renewed lighting. It was the energy of the place, the way people moved, talked, existed in that space. Clara observed everything from the small stage, where she carefully tuned her guitar. Not just any guitar, but a special instrument. A gift from a Spanish luthier who had seen the viral video and been moved by her story. It was made of Brazilian rosewood and spruce, with mother-of-pearl details on the neck. It sounded like herself, strong and delicate at the same time. The Strings for All project was celebrating its 6th month of existence. Born from that unlikely night, it had grown far beyond initial expectations. What had started as a series of accessible concerts at the hotel had transformed into a music education program for young people from underprivileged communities. With regular classes and donated instruments, Eduardo was at the back of the ballroom, talking with potential sponsors. He dressed more simply now, with less ostentation. It hadn't been an overnight transformation. There was resistance, relapses into old arrogance, moments of tension. But slowly, like a complex melody that reveals itself note by note, he was beginning to change. "Are you nervous?" asked Donna Helena, approaching Clara with a glass of water. Clara smiled, thanking her for the gesture. "A little," she admitted. "It's different when they're the ones playing." She looked at the clock on the wall. In 20 minutes, the ballroom would be full, not of millionaires in formal attire, but of families, workers, students, people who normally wouldn't have access to this type of event. And on stage, there wouldn't be just Clara, but also her students, performing for the first time. Among them was Julia, a 12-year-old girl with natural talent that reminded Clara of herself at that age. Daughter of a house cleaner who worked at the hotel, Julia had fallen in love with guitar since the first lesson. She practiced for hours until her fingers hurt and her mother insisted she rest. "She reminds me of you," commented Donna Helena, following Clara's gaze. Same determination in her eyes. Clara nodded, feeling a different emotion grow inside her. A mixture of pride, hope, and a kind of continuity she hadn't expected to find so soon in life. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was an Instagram notification. Her profile, Clara Mendez Music, had reached 500,000 followers. The online classes she had started giving as a complement to the in-person project were reaching people throughout the country and beyond. Comments from Portugal, Angola, Mozambique, and other Portuguese-speaking countries appeared regularly. She put away her phone when she saw Eduardo approaching. It was still strange, this new relationship between them. They weren't exactly friends, but there was a mutual respect that grew with each project they realized together. "The theater confirmed for next month," he said, without beating around the bush. "Capacity for 1,000 people, professional sound system." Exactly as we requested, Clara felt her heart race. Playing again at the Municipal Theater, the same stage where she had performed for the last time before the accident, before losing everything, was a dream she hadn't dared to have until a few months ago. "Thank you," she said, simply. Eduardo nodded. He had learned to economize words, to speak less and listen more. It was a slow process, full of challenges, but genuine. "The investors are interested in expanding the project to other cities," he continued, especially after that TV Cultura documentary. Clara remembered the film crew that had followed the project for weeks, capturing classes, rehearsals, life stories. The documentary, titled Hands That Speak, had been broadcast in prime time and received enthusiastic reviews. "Do you think we're ready for that?" she asked, genuinely interested in his opinion. It was one of the most surprising changes in their dynamic. Eduardo had become a competent business partner. His knowledge of marketing, finance, and public relations, previously used only to increase his own fortune and status, now served a greater purpose. "I think you are," he replied with a discreet smile. "As you always were." The comment hung between them, loaded with unspoken meanings. For a moment, Clara glimpsed the man Eduardo could have been from the beginning, if he hadn't been so wrapped up in his own importance. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of the first students, nervous and excited about the imminent performance. Julia came at the front, carrying her guitar with the care of someone transporting a fragile treasure. "Teacher, can I practice one more time?" she asked, with eyes shining with anxiety and determination. Clara smiled, recognizing in Julia the same fire that had consumed her at that age. That pure passion, not yet stained by external expectations or practical concerns. "Of course," she replied, adjusting the chair for the girl. "Show Eduardo what you learned this week." Julia sat down, adjusted her posture as Clara had taught her, and began to play. It was a simplified version of The Girl from Ipanema, but executed with impressive precision for someone with only 6 months of study. Eduardo watched in silence, genuinely impressed. He remembered the first time he had heard Clara play, on that night that seemed so distant now. The same feeling of wonder, of witnessing something special, invaded him. "You have a gift," he said to the girl when she finished. "Keep it up." Julia's face lit up with the compliment. For her, Eduardo wasn't the arrogant millionaire from the story. Everyone knew. He was just the uncle who helped teacher Clara realize those wonderful events. Clara observed the interaction with a mixture of surprise and satisfaction. Perhaps Eduardo's transformation was deeper than she imagined. The other students were arriving, filling the small space reserved for backstage. There were 20 in total, ages ranging from 8 to 60. The oldest, So Antonio, was the hotel's night porter, who had always dreamed of learning music, but never had the opportunity. Clara gathered everyone in a circle, as she did before each class. It was a ritual she had created to calm nerves, both theirs and her own. "Remember," she said, looking into each one's eyes, "it doesn't matter if you miss a note or lose the rhythm. What matters is the emotion you put into the music. That's what touches people." The words hung in the air like a blessing. Clara knew they were true, not just for music, but for life in general. That's what she had learned in recent months. Technical perfection, while important, would never replace, while the students made final adjustment of their instrument. Clara stepped away a bit, seeking a moment of quiet before the performance. She leaned against a window that overlooked the hotel gardens, watching the sky that was beginning to be tinged with the colors of sunset. She thought of her parents. Her father, a history teacher, who had saved for years to buy her first quality guitar. Her mother, a nurse, who always found energy, even after exhausting shifts, to take her to lessons and performances. Both had believed in her from the beginning, had seen the potential that not even she herself could see. "You would be proud," she murmured to the sky, feeling a solitary tear run down her face. The accident that took them had been sudden, brutal. A runaway truck, a miscalculated curve, a guardrail that didn't resist the impact. In a single moment, Clara had lost not only her parents, but also her compass in the world. Hospital bills, the funeral, expenses accumulated during months when she couldn't work. Everything had forced her to sell the apartment, furniture, and finally, the guitar her father had given her. Grief had paralyzed her. Music, which had once been refuge, had become painful memory. Every chord brought back memories of recitals with her parents in the audience, family dinners after performances, practice nights with her mother asleep on the sofa, waiting to go home together. That's why she had buried that part of herself. She became invisible, anonymous, one among so many people who silently fought to survive in a city that celebrated only success, never resilience, until that night. The sound of applause brought her back to the present. The ballroom was full. Entire families, workers still in uniform, students with backpacks on their backs, a diverse and enthusiastic audience, very different from the one that usually frequented the hotel. Eduardo took the stage to welcome everyone. Clara observed his posture, his tone of voice. There were still traces of the old Eduardo, the confidence, natural charisma, projected voice, but there was something new too, a genuine humility, a purpose that went beyond himself. "Welcome to the 6th meeting of the Strings for All project," he said into the microphone. "Tonight is a special night, as our students will perform for the first time." He paused, looking toward the back of the ballroom, where Clara was with the students. 6 months ago, this ballroom witnessed a moment that changed many lives. The extraordinary talent of one person reminded us that beauty and excellence don't belong to a social class or type of people. They're everywhere, just waiting for the opportunity to flourish. Clara felt a lump in her throat. She never expected to hear such words from Eduardo Vasconcelos. "It is with great honor that I present to you the artistic director and soul of this project, Clara Mendes." The applause was warm when Clara took the stage. She wore a simple dress, navy blue, very different from the uniform Eduardo had first seen her in. Her hair, once always tied in a severe bun for work, fell in soft waves over her shoulders. "Thank you all for coming," she said, with a clear and firm voice. "Music has always been, for me, a form of connection, with other people, with emotions, with parts of ourselves that we sometimes forget exist." She looked at her students, who waited anxiously backstage. "Today we'll share with you not just music, but also stories of overcoming discovery, second chances. Each person who will play on this stage carries a unique journey, and it's this diversity that makes our project so special." She gestured for the first group of students to enter. 5 children, between 8 and 10 years old, positioned themselves with their small guitars. Julia was at the center as the group's leader. To begin, we'll hear Asa Branca by Luis Gonzaga, interpreted by our youngest students. Clara gave the signal, and the children began to play. It wasn't perfect. There were some notes out of time, small technical errors, but there was a genuine joy, a dedication that was contagious to the audience. Parents smiled proudly, some with tears in their eyes. Other guests swayed their heads to the rhythm, involved by the simplicity and honesty of the performance. Eduardo, sitting in the front row, observed everything with an expression Clara had never seen before. It was a mixture of contentment and something deeper, more significant, perhaps the satisfaction of participating in something genuinely good. For the first time in a long time, the night continued, group after group. There were solo performances, duets, even a small ensemble that played an adapted version of Aquarela do Brasil. The last to perform was Seu Antonio, the night porter. At 62 years old, hands calloused by decades of manual work, he played a moving version of Chão de Giz by Zé Ramalho. When the last note faded, there was a moment of reverent silence, followed by an explosion of applause. Clara couldn't contain tears of pride. It was as if each of her students carried a piece of her own journey, her own redemption. Eduardo returned to the stage for final acknowledgments.
He announced that the project would be expanded to 3 more locations in the city,
and that there would be full scholarships for the most talented students to study at the National Conservatory, the same one where Clara had graduated. And to close the night, he said, with a conspiratorial smile, a special gift. Clara Mendes will play an original composition created especially for this occasion. Clara wasn't expecting this. Eduardo hadn't mentioned that she would play solo. She felt a chill in her stomach, that old performance anxiety she thought she had forgotten. But when she picked up the guitar and felt its familiar weight in her arms, when she looked at the audience and saw expectant and welcoming faces, something calmed inside her. She was no longer the young prodigy trying to prove her worth, nor the invisible cleaning lady fighting to survive. She was just Clara, complete in her vulnerability and strength. This music, she said into the microphone, is called Rebirth. It's dedicated to everyone who has ever lost their way and needed to reinvent themselves. Her fingers touched the first notes, hesitant like steps in unknown territory. Then they gained confidence, weaving a melody that spoke of loss, of forced silence, of years hidden in shadows. The rhythm was initially contained, almost timid, like someone who fears being noticed. Gradually, the music transformed. Higher notes emerged, like rays of sun breaking through heavy clouds. The rhythm accelerated, became more complex. Clara closed her eyes, letting herself be completely carried away by the composition, by that story that was simultaneously hers and universal. The audience was mesmerized. No one coughed, no one whispered, no one checked their phone. It was as if everyone was breathing together, moved by the same invisible current. When the music reached its climax, a succession of powerful chords that spoke of liberation, of self-acceptance, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, that almost mystical connection between artist, work, and audience. It was as if the hotel walls had disappeared, as if they were all floating together in a space where only music mattered. The last notes were delicate but not sad. They spoke of hope, of new beginnings, of cycles that close so others can open. The silence that followed was profound, almost sacred. Then slowly applause began. It wasn't polite or perfunctory applause, but a genuine explosion of emotion. People stood up, some cried openly. Julia, backstage, looked at her teacher with absolute admiration, as if witnessing a miracle. Eduardo was the first to stand. His usually calculating eyes were teary. He applauded vigorously, not caring about image or what others would think. In that moment, he was just another human being touched by art. Clara thanked with a simple bow. Words weren't necessary. The music had already said everything that needed to be said. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of rain gently tapping against the window of her new apartment. It was a small but cozy place, very different from the employee quarters where she had lived for recent years. The white walls were decorated with black and white photographs, her parents at a picnic, the municipal theater illuminated at night. Her first public performance at 12 years old. She stretched in bed, feeling a good kind of tiredness, the kind that comes after. The previous night's performance had been an absolute success. Social media was full of videos and enthusiastic comments. There were already invitations for performances in other places, interview requests, messages from former conservatory colleagues. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a message from Eduardo. Meeting with new investors, 2 p.m. Bring your guitar. Clara smiled. The message, short and direct, reflected the new dynamic between them. They weren't close friends, but they had found a professional balance based on mutual respect. Eduardo had learned to value her talent and artistic vision. She had learned to take advantage of his business knowledge and connections. She got up, made strong coffee, and sat by the window, watching the rain transform the city. She remembered how she used to hate rainy days when she worked in cleaning. They meant more dirt in the hallways, more work, wet uniforms that took forever to dry in the small windowless room. Now, the rain seemed different. It was renewal, possibility, a gentle reminder that even the simplest things could be seen in completely different ways, depending on where we found ourselves. The guitar rested on its stand in the corner of the room. Clara walked to it, lightly running her fingers over the strings without really playing them. She was composing again, small melodies that arose in her mind at the most unexpected moments, fragments of emotions that needed to be translated into music. The phone rang. It was Roberto Martins, the music critic, who had witnessed her rediscovery that night at the hotel. "Clara, dear, did you see the paper today?" "Not yet," she replied, intrigued. "There's an entire article about the project. Front page of the cultural section. They're calling it a silent revolution in music education. You should be proud." Clara smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude. It's collective work, she said sincerely. Each student, each person involved is part of it. Well, I'll talk about it on my show tonight, and I want you to be my guest next month. We can discuss the project, you can play live. What do you think? The old fear of exposure threatened to emerge, but Clara pushed it away. It was part of her journey now, not just playing, but also talking, sharing, inspiring. It would be a pleasure, she replied. After hanging up, Clara opened her laptop to check her emails. There were dozens of them. Messages of support, requests for information about the project, invitations for partnerships. One in particular caught her attention. The sender was Antonio Carlos Jobim, one of the country's biggest music producers, known for discovering and promoting exceptional talents. Dear Ms. Mendez, the message read, I've been following your story and recent work with the Strings for All project with great interest. I would like to invite you to discuss the possibility of recording an album with your original compositions, as well as classical guitar pieces. I believe your music and your story have the power to touch many lives. Clara reread the message several times, barely believing it. An album? Her music reaching people beyond those who could attend concerts? It was a dream she hadn't even dared to have in recent years. She picked up her phone, hesitated, and finally called the only person who could completely understand the meaning of that moment. Donna Helena, it's Clara. Can you come have coffee with me? I have news. The woman who had been her confidant during difficult years, who had welcomed her when she arrived at the hotel desperately seeking employment, who had kept her secret about her musical past, deserved to be the first to know. More than a work colleague, Donna Helena had been an anchor when everything else seemed to be drifting. While waiting for the visit, Clara returned to the guitar. This time she played deliberately, a new melody that had been forming in her mind since the previous night's performance. It was something about unexpected encounters, about how the most transformative moments in our lives often begin as the most painful. She thought of Eduardo, of the long path they had traveled since that fateful night, how a public humiliation almost suffered had transformed into the opportunity to rebuild her life and help others find their own voice. There was something poetic about it, something that deserved to be translated into music. The doorbell rang. Donna Helena arrived bringing fresh cheese bread, a tradition between them since the times when they shared quick breakfasts before work shifts began. So, girl, said the woman, with that direct manner that was her trademark. What's the big news that couldn't wait? Clara showed her the email, watching the woman's eyes widen as she read. Holy Mother of God, Donna Helena murmured, making the sign of the cross. An album. I knew this would happen. I knew it since I saw you playing that night. You always believed in me, even when I had given up, said Clara. Moved. Because I know talent when I see it, replied the woman, with simplicity. And because I know that life can knock us down, but it doesn't have to keep us on the ground. They shared coffee and memories, of difficult days at the hotel, of small kindnesses that had made life bearable, of dreams that seemed impossible and were now becoming reality. And Eduardo? Asked Donna Helena with a mischievous gleam in her eyes. You two, Clara laughed, shaking her head. We're project partners, nothing more. He's still learning to be a better person. I'm still learning to trust again. We don't mix things up. Donna Helena shrugged, with an enigmatic smile. Time is wise, my daughter. Time is wise. The following months passed like a whirlwind. The Strings for All project expanded to 5 different locations in the city, serving more than 200 students. There were reports in national newspapers, a special feature on a Sunday program, invitations to take the initiative to other cities. Clara divided her time between classes, project administration and album recording. The studio was a new and challenging environment, very different from the stages she was used to. Each note was permanently recorded. Each musical choice would be heard countless times by people she would never meet. Initially, the pressure paralyzed her. She spent hours trying to record a single track, never satisfied with the result. The producer, Antonio Carlos, noticed her anguish. Clara, he said, during a particularly frustrating break, you're trying to be perfect, but that's not what people want to hear. What do they want then? She asked, exhausted. They want to hear you. The real person behind the technique. The true story behind the notes. Those words were a revelation. Clara had spent so much time trying to hide, first behind the cleaning lady's uniform, then behind impeccable musical technique, that she had forgotten how to simply be. In the next recording session, she approached the music differently. Instead of seeking technical perfection, she focused on the emotion she wanted to convey. She allowed herself to be vulnerable, let imperfections become part of the interpretation. The result was transformative. Rebirth, the album's title track, was recorded in a single take. Raw, honest, imperfect in some technical aspects, but deeply true. "That," said Antonio Carlos, with tears in his eyes when the last note faded, "that is real music." Eduardo followed the process from a distance, absorbed in his own projects, but always present when necessary. The transformation in him was visible to anyone who had known him before. He spoke less, listened more. He thought beyond immediate benefit, considering the impact of his actions in a broader context. On a Sunday afternoon, while Clara rehearsed for an important performance, he appeared at the studio with a box in his hands. "I brought something for you," he said. With unusual shyness, Clara opened the box carefully. Inside was an old guitar, with marks of use and a patina that only time could create. "Where did you find this?" she asked, immediately recognizing the instrument. "It was difficult," Eduardo admitted. "I had to hire a private detective. It was with a collector in São Paulo. I paid much more than it's worth commercially." "But it's my father's guitar," Clara interrupted, with a choked voice. Eduardo nodded. "I thought it should come back to you." Clara took the instrument with reverence, feeling the familiar weight, the small imperfections that made it unique. She ran her fingers over the strings, and the sound, although needing tuning, was like the voice of a very dear friend returning after a long absence. "Why?" she asked, looking at Eduardo. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I want to do things the right way. Not just for the project or for image or for any practical benefit, but because it's the right thing to do." There was genuine vulnerability in his voice, a discomfort with emotional exposure that Clara had never seen before. It was as if the real Eduardo, the one who existed under layers of arrogance and privilege, was finally emerging. "Thank you," Clara said simply. There weren't enough words to express what that gesture meant. Eduardo nodded, visibly relieved to have been understood without needing more explanations. "See you at the album launch," he said. "Heading to the door. Eduardo," Clara called before he left. "You're going to play too, right?" He laughed, shaking his head. "Nobody wants to hear my amateur attempts. You promised to learn, remember? Part of our agreement." Eduardo hesitated, then smiled, a genuine smile, without traces of old arrogance. "A promise is a debt," he replied. "But don't expect much. I have businessman's fingers, not musicians." The day of the album launch coincided with the first anniversary of the Strings for All project. Clara had chosen the date deliberately. It was a way to honor the connection between her personal journey and the social work that had become so important in her life. The event would take place at the Municipal Theater, the same stage where, years before, she had given her last performance before the accident that changed everything. There was a poetic symmetry to it, a closing of the circle that hadn't gone unnoticed by the cultural press. Backstage, Clara adjusted the sapphire blue dress she had chosen for the occasion. It was elegant without being ostentatious, brilliant without overshadowing. Like herself, she thought, smiling at the mirror. Julia entered the room, already dressed for her special participation. The girl, now 13, had become a kind of protégé of Clara's. Her natural talent, cultivated with tireless dedication, flourished each day. "Nervous?" asked Clara, helping her arrange the bow that held her hair. "A little," the girl admitted. "But you always say that nervousness is just energy that needs to be channeled into music," Clara smiled, recognizing her own words. It was strange and wonderful to see how her teachings gained their own life through her students. "You know what makes me most nervous?" continued Julia, arranging her sheet music. "My mom has never seen me play in such an important place." Julia's mother, Marcia, worked as a house cleaner in 3 different homes. On project performance days, she was usually at one of her jobs, unable to follow her daughter's progress. "Will she come today?" asked Clara, already imagining a solution if the answer was negative. "She'll try," replied Julia, with that early resignation of children who learn about life's limitations early. But she said she might only be able to arrive halfway through. Clara made a mental note to reserve a special place, even if Marcia arrived late. No mother should miss the chance to see her daughter shine because of life's circumstances. A light knock on the door announced Eduardo's arrival. He was also elegant, but in a more restrained way than usual. The dark suit was impeccably cut, but without unnecessary ostentation. "It's almost time," he said. "The house is packed." Clara nodded, feeling that familiar mixture of anxiety and excitement that preceded each important performance. But there was something more now, a serenity that came from the certainty of being exactly where she should be, doing exactly what she should do. "The sponsors are enthusiastic," continued Eduardo. "There are already talks about expanding the project to other major cities next year." "One thing at a time," replied Clara, smiling. "Let's make tonight special. Then we'll think about the future." Eduardo nodded, understanding. He had learned to respect Clara's sense of timing, not just in music, but in life. She had taught him that not everything needed to be immediate, that some things benefited from patience, from slow maturation. "I brought something for good luck," he said. Extending a small box, Clara opened it, curious. Inside was a delicate guitar-shaped brooch, set with small blue stones that matched her dress perfectly. "It's sapphire," Eduardo explained. "They say it brings clarity and wisdom." I thought it was appropriate. Clara looked at him, surprised not just by the gift, but by the thought behind it. It was a gesture that revealed observation, consideration, qualities the old Eduardo would never demonstrate. "It's beautiful," she said, pinning the brooch to her dress. "Thank you." There was a moment of silence between them, loaded with unsaid things. Clara realized that something had subtly changed in their dynamic. It wasn't just professional respect or mutual gratitude. It was something more complex, more nuanced, something that perhaps needed time to be completely understood. The moment was interrupted by the stage assistant, announcing that there were 5 minutes until the start. "I'll go to my seat," said Eduardo, heading to the door. He stopped for a moment as if he wanted to say something more, but just smiled and left. Clara adjusted the brooch, feeling its delicate weight against the dress fabric. She breathed deeply, centering herself. This night wasn't just about music, or about her personal return to the stage she had once abandoned. It was about transformation, hers, Eduardo's, each student who had discovered in music a new way of existing in the world. The auditorium was packed, as Eduardo had said. Clara peeked briefly through a gap in the curtain, seeing the impressive diversity of the audience. There were music critics, celebrities, important figures from the cultural scene. But there were also simple families, workers, students, people who normally wouldn't frequent the municipal theater, but who were there because they had been touched somehow by the project. In the front row, Clara saw Donna Helena, elegant in a navy blue dress she probably reserved for very special occasions. Next to her was So Antonio, the night porter, looking slightly uncomfortable in a suit that seemed to have been taken from the closet after a long hibernation. Both represented the beginning of everything, the people who had known her in the most difficult moments, and who now shared her joy. Eduardo was seated a little further back, next to investors and sponsors. Even from afar, Clara could perceive his tense posture, the way he constantly adjusted his tie, signs of nervousness he tried to disguise. The lights began to dim. It was time. Clara gathered her students in a circle, as she always did before performances. There were 20 children and teenagers, selected from among the more than 200 who participated in the project. "Remember," she said, looking into each one's eyes, "no matter what happens out there, you're already winners for being here. Play with your heart. The rest will come naturally." The presenter took the stage. It was Roberto Martins, the music critic who had witnessed Clara's rediscovery that night at the hotel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, with a grave and emotional voice, "a year ago, I witnessed something extraordinary. A woman the world had forgotten reminded the world and herself of music's transformative power." Clara listened attentively as Roberto narrated her story, without romanticizing the difficult moments, without diminishing the real struggles she had faced. It was strange to hear her own journey told this way, as an inspiring narrative for others. "Tonight," Roberto continued, "we celebrate not only the launch of an exceptional album, Rebirth, but also the first anniversary of a project that is changing lives through music. Ladies and gentlemen, with great honor, I present to you Clara Mendez and the young musicians of the Strings for All project." The applause was deafening when Clara and her students entered the stage. The children, despite visible nervousness, positioned themselves with the dignity she had taught them. They weren't objects of charity or examples of overcoming. They were musicians, artists, human beings expressing themselves through art. The first piece was a special arrangement of Asa Branca, with Clara soloing while the students provided accompaniment. It was a deliberate choice, to start with something deeply Brazilian, accessible, that spoke of difficulties and hope at the same time. While playing, Clara observed the faces in the audience. She saw smiles, contained tears, expressions of surprise upon realizing the children's skill level. She saw Eduardo, completely absorbed, as if witnessing something sacred. After the pieces with the students, it was time for Clara to play alone. She had chosen 3 compositions from her new album: Silence, about the years when she abandoned music; Encounter, inspired by that fateful night at the hotel; and Rebirth, the title track that spoke of reconstruction and new beginnings. When she finished the last note of Rebirth, there was a moment of absolute silence, as if the entire audience held its breath. Then, an explosion of applause that seemed to shake the very walls of the theater. Clara thanked with a simple bow. Her eyes met Eduardo's in the audience. He applauded standing, with an expression of pride and something more. Something that looked very much like genuine admiration. For the closing, Clara had planned a surprise. Julia would play a solo piece, Prelude No. 1 by Villa-Lobos, a challenging composition even for experienced guitarists. The girl was nervous, but determined. "And now," Clara announced into the microphone, "I have the pleasure of presenting a young artist who represents the future of Brazilian classical music. At only 13 years old and with less than a year of formal study, she demonstrates extraordinary talent and dedication. Ladies and gentlemen, Julia Oliveira." The applause was warm when the girl entered the stage, dressed in a simple white dress that highlighted her youth and innocence. Clara noticed that Julia searched for someone in the audience, her mother, who apparently hadn't arrived yet. For a moment, Clara feared that disappointment would affect the girl's performance. But Julia was stronger than she appeared. She adjusted the guitar, breathed deeply as Clara had taught her, and began to play. The first notes were perfect, clear, precise, emotional. The audience, which perhaps expected something simpler from a child, was visibly impressed. Clara watched proudly, recognizing in Julia not just talent, but that rare combination of sensitivity and discipline that characterizes great artists. It was then that she noticed movement at the theater's side door. It was Marcia, Julia's mother, still dressed in her work uniform, visibly exhausted, but with a look of absolute determination. A security guard tried to prevent her from entering during the performance, following theater protocol. Without thinking twice, Clara made a discreet gesture to Eduardo, who understood immediately. In seconds, he was beside the security guard, resolving the situation. Marcia was escorted to a place in the front row, exactly when Julia reached the most difficult passage of the piece. The girl saw her mother sitting down, and her face lit up. Her fingers seemed to gain new energy, new confidence. The music flowed even more beautifully, more heartfelt. Clara watched the scene with a full heart. This is what the project meant in the end, not just teaching musical technique, but creating connections, strengthening bonds, allowing people to express love and pride in ways they might not achieve with words. When Julia finished, the audience exploded in applause. The girl, radiant, made a perfect bow, exactly as Clara had taught her. Her eyes sought her mother in the audience, and the smile they exchanged was worth more than all the glowing reviews they would receive later. For the grand finale, Clara invited all the students back to the stage. Together they played a special version of Aquarela do Brasil, arranged for multiple guitars. It was a celebration of Brazilian identity, of resistance, of beauty that persists even in difficult times. At the end of the music, to everyone's surprise, Eduardo took the stage with his own guitar. As promised, he had learned the basics, just some simple chords, played with the intense concentration of a beginner. "This is my contribution," he said into the microphone. "Proof that everyone can learn, regardless of age or circumstance. Music isn't the privilege of few, but the right of all." His gaze met Clara's, and there was genuine vulnerability there, the fear of making mistakes publicly, mixed with the courage to try anyway. It was perhaps the most significant transformation in the man who once defined his worth only by power and status. Together, Clara, Eduardo, and all the students played a simplified version of Imagine by John Lennon, chosen deliberately for its message of unity and hope. Eduardo played only the basic chords, but he did so with total commitment, absolute concentration. When the last note faded, the entire theater was standing, applauding. It wasn't just for the music itself, but for what that moment represented. The possibility of transformation, of connection across differences, of second chances. Clara looked at everyone on stage, her students, Eduardo, Julia, and then at the diverse audience. She saw Donna Helena crying openly, Sir Antonio applauding enthusiastically, Marcia hugging her daughter backstage, Roberto Martins making enthusiastic notes for his review. It was a mosaic of lives touched and transformed, all connected by 6 strings tensioned over polished wood. A guitar, a simple instrument that, in the right hands, could build bridges between worlds that seemed irreconcilably separate. At the end of the night, as the theater slowly emptied, Clara remained on stage, absorbing the moment. Eduardo approached, still carrying his student guitar. "We did it," he said simply. Clara nodded. Many words weren't necessary between them now. They had shared a journey that few would completely understand. From disdain to admiration, from humiliation to respect, from isolation to connection. What comes now? asked Eduardo, looking at the nearly empty theater. Clara smiled, lightly touching her guitar strings. More music, she replied. Always more music. A year later, Clara sat on the balcony of her new apartment, watching the sun set over the city. The place was modest compared to Eduardo's standards, but for her, it represented an unimaginable luxury after years in the employee quarters. Space, natural light, silence when desired, music when necessary. Her second album had been released a month ago, reaching the top of classical and instrumental music charts. Critics were unanimous in praising not just her impeccable technique, but mainly the genuine emotion she transmitted through the guitar strings. Music that speaks directly to the soul, wrote a respected critic. The Strings for All project now existed in 5 different cities, serving more than 1,000 students. There was a long waiting list, and plans to expand even more next year. Clara remained involved in each new center, personally training teachers, ensuring that the project's essence, dignity, accessible excellence, transformation through art, remained intact. Julia, now 14, had received a full scholarship to study at the National Conservatory, the same one where Clara had graduated. Her talent flourished in ways that surprised even the most experienced teachers. "She has something rare," commented the director. "It's not just technique, it's soul." Marcia, Julia's mother, no longer needed to work as a house cleaner in 3 different places. Clara had invited her to be administrative coordinator of the original project, taking advantage of her natural organization and tireless commitment. With a decent salary and regular hours, Marcia could finally closely follow her daughter's development. Donna Helena had retired from the hotel, but remained active in the project as a kind of collective grandmother, taking care of small details that made all the difference. From ensuring the smallest children ate properly to offering words of encouragement before performances. And Eduardo had surprised everyone, perhaps even himself. Clara's phone rang, interrupting her reflections. It was him. "I'm in the car, arriving in 10 minutes, he said, with that mixture of efficiency and enthusiasm that had become his trademark. "I brought the revised contracts and a bottle of wine to celebrate." Clara smiled. In recent months, these work meetings at her house had become increasingly frequent and increasingly less formal. They started talking about the project, new sponsors, planned expansions, and ended up talking about music, books, philosophy. "Life. I'll be waiting," she replied, hanging up. She looked at the guitar leaning on the chair beside her. Not the expensive instrument she used in concerts, but her father's old guitar, which Eduardo had recovered. She had spent the afternoon composing, working on a new piece that still had no name. It was something different from everything she had created, lighter, more luminous, as if the shadows of the past were finally completely dissipating. She heard the doorbell and went to answer. Eduardo was in the hallway, holding a folder of documents in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. He dressed more casually now, well-cut pants and a long-sleeved shirt rolled up at the cuffs, without the ostentation that once seemed necessary to affirm his status. "Come in," Clara invited, smiling. Eduardo entered, observing the apartment with that appreciative look he had developed in recent times, no longer evaluating monetary value, but noticing the small details that made the space unique. The photographs on the walls, the books on the shelves, the plants Clara cultivated with care. "I brought the news you asked for," he said, placing the folder on the table. "The Ministry of Culture approved the project for the North and Northeast regions. We'll have guaranteed funding for 3 years." Clara took the folder, quickly flipping through the documents. It was an ambitious expansion, taking Strings for All to areas where access to music education was practically non-existent, a dream that seemed impossible when everything began. "This is incredible," she said, genuinely moved. "How much work we have ahead," Eduardo smiled, opening the wine bottle with the skill of someone who grew up in environments where that gesture was every day. "Work that's worth it," he replied, serving 2 glasses. "How's the composition for the new album going?" Clara took the glass he offered, their fingers touching briefly in the process, moving forward. "I was working on something new today, actually." "Want to hear?" Eduardo nodded, sitting on the sofa with a naturalness that didn't exist at the beginning of their relationship. He remembered how tense and formal he was in the first months of the project, always worried about appearances, always calculating the next step. Clara picked up her father's guitar, adjusting it in her lap with habitual care. She closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself, and then began to play. The melody was soft as a spring morning, with notes that seemed to dance in the air like rays of sun through an open window. There was an almost ethereal quality to the composition, but also a solidity, a certainty that spoke of peace conquered after a long battle. Eduardo watched Clara's fingers move over the strings with that precision that never failed to fascinate him. There was something hypnotic about the way she gave herself completely to music, as if nothing else existed in that moment besides the silent dialogue between artist and instrument. When the last note faded in the air, there was a moment of reverent silence. Eduardo realized he had leaned forward, completely absorbed in the performance. "It's beautiful," he said finally. "Different from what you usually compose. More hopeful." Clara smiled, surprised and satisfied with the precise observation. "That's exactly it. I was thinking of calling it Aurora." "Perfect," replied Eduardo, with genuine admiration. Like a new dawn. They drank wine in silence for a few moments, appreciating the moment. Clara observed Eduardo discreetly, noticing the small changes that time had wrought in him. It wasn't just the expression lines around his eyes, or the few gray hairs beginning to appear at his temples. It was something deeper, a quality of presence, of genuine attention that didn't exist before. "You know," she said, "finally, I never imagined we'd be here. 2 years after that night." Eduardo laughed softly, shaking his head. "I was a complete idiot, wasn't I?" "Let's say there was room for growth," replied Clara, with an understanding smile. "That's a gentle way to put it," he admitted. "Sometimes I look back and barely recognize that person. It's like—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "Like it was another life," completed Clara. "I understand. I feel the same way about the person I was. Hidden, silenced, afraid to shine." Eduardo looked at her with an intensity that made Clara feel sudden warmth rising up her neck. "You always had your own light," he said, with a low voice. "Even when you were invisible to others. Even when you tried to hide. That never changed." Clara felt something change in the air between them. A subtle tension that had been growing for months, perhaps since the beginning, but which both had avoided acknowledging. It was complicated, this new territory. Neither simple friendship nor professional partnership, but something more nuanced, more challenging. "What are we doing, Eduardo?" she asked, placing her glass on the table. He immediately understood the question. It wasn't about the wine or the contracts or the project. It was about them, about this cautious dance they had been performing, approaching and withdrawing, testing limits, exploring possibilities. "I'm trying to be a better person," he replied with surprising honesty, "and I discovered I can only do that near you." Clara felt her heart accelerate. It wasn't a conventional romantic declaration, but it was deeply true, and perhaps more meaningful for that very reason. "I'm afraid," she admitted, with the same honesty, "not just of you or of us, but of myself, of trusting again, of allowing myself to be vulnerable." Eduardo nodded, understanding. He knew Clara's story, not just the loss of her parents, but also a previous relationship that had ended painfully, contributing to her withdrawal from music. He knew that for her, trusting was an act of almost heroic courage. "I'm not in a hurry," he said simply. "I'm learning that the best things in life can't be rushed or forced. Like good music, it needs the right time, the right space to breathe and develop." Clara smiled, touched by the metaphor. It was evident how much Eduardo had changed. The man she had met 2 years before would never speak like this, would never understand of organic development. "You really have been studying music," she commented, with a touch of admiration. Eduardo shrugged, with a shy smile. "I have an excellent teacher." The moment was interrupted by Clara's phone ringing. "It was Julia. Teacher," exclaimed the teenager, barely containing her excitement. "I just received the letter. I was selected for the exchange program in Barcelona. I'm going to study with Maestro Segovia for 6 months. Clara felt a wave of pride and joy. The exchange program was extremely competitive, open to only 2 students per year. That Julia had been chosen, at only 14 years old, and with less than 2 years of formal study, was testimony not only to her extraordinary talent, but also to her tireless dedication. "Julia, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." "It's all thanks to you, teacher," replied the girl with a choked voice. "If it weren't for you for the project, I never would have touched a guitar in my life." "No, dear," corrected Clara gently. "The talent was always in you. I just helped awaken it." They talked for a few more minutes, discussing the practical details of the exchange. When she hung up, Clara had tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of that deep joy that comes from seeing someone you love realize their potential. "Good news?" asked Eduardo, who had stepped away discreetly during the call. "Julia was selected for the exchange program in Barcelona," replied Clara, wiping away a tear. "She's going to study with one of the greatest masters of classical guitar." Eduardo smiled, genuinely happy for the girl he had met when everything began, and who was now becoming a promising young artist. "That deserves another celebration," he said. refilling the glasses. To a bright future, they toasted, smiling at each other over the rim of the glasses. There was so much to celebrate, not just the visible, measurable achievements that could be listed on resumes or announced in newspapers, but also the internal transformations, the barriers overcome, the fears faced. "I'm thinking of taking a few weeks vacation," commented Clara casually. "After we finish implementing the new centers." "Vacation?" repeated Eduardo, surprised. "I don't remember you taking a day off since everything began." Clara laughed, recognizing the truth in the observation. She had plunged into work, first into the project, then into recordings, performances, classes, with an intensity that sometimes bordered on obsession. It was her way of compensating for lost years, of honoring the second chance she had received. "Exactly because of that," she replied. "I think I need to breathe a little, gain perspective, maybe visit places I've always wanted to know." "Like where?" asked Eduardo, genuinely interested. "Andalusia," replied Clara, without hesitation. "I want to see where flamenco was born, feel that land, that culture that produced one of the most passionate forms of music that ever existed." Eduardo nodded, understanding the appeal. For a musician like Clara, it would be almost a pilgrimage, a direct connection with the roots of a tradition that had profoundly influenced classical guitar. "It's a trip I've always wanted to take," she continued, with a dreamy gleam in her eyes. "My father talked about it when I was a child. He never managed to go, but he collected books, records, stories about the great flamenco masters." "You should go," said Eduardo with conviction. "It's important to honor those old dreams." Clara looked at him, feeling a sudden wave of affection for this man who had learned to value dreams, not just the grandiose ones, measurable in money and status, but also the intimate personal ones, those that feed the soul. "Would you like to come with me?" she asked, surprising herself with the spontaneous invitation. Eduardo was momentarily speechless, clearly not expecting the invitation. A subtle blush rose up his neck, a vulnerability the old Eduardo would never allow to be seen. "Are you sure?" he asked finally. "It would be different from what we have now." Clara nodded, understanding all the unspoken implications. A trip together would be a significant step, a declaration that they were exploring possibilities beyond friendship and professional partnership. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she said, choosing her words carefully, "about second chances, about allowing myself to be happy again. It's not easy for me. To trust, to open up, to risk." Eduardo listened with absolute attention, giving her space to express what she felt. "But I realized that sometimes the biggest risk is not risking anything," continued Clara, "being so trapped by fear of getting hurt that you end up losing opportunities for joy, for growth." She paused, looking directly into his eyes. "I don't know what we are exactly, or what we could be, but I'd like to find out, without pressure, without excessive expectations. One step at a time." Eduardo smiled, a genuine, warm smile that illuminated his eyes in a way Clara had learned to value. "I'd love to go to Andalusia with you," he replied simply. "One step at a time sounds perfect." They remained in silence for a moment, appreciating the new possibility that opened before them. It wasn't a cliched happy ending from fairy tales. It was something more real, more nuanced, with all the complexity and uncertainty of true life. But there was beauty in it, in the mutual vulnerability, in the willingness to risk, in the courage to try again. Clara picked up the guitar, adjusting it in her lap. Without saying anything, she began to play. Not Aurora, the hopeful new composition, but the piece she had played that fateful night at the hotel. Bach, Prelude from Suite No. 1 for cello, adapted for guitar. Eduardo closed his eyes, letting himself be carried away by the music, by the memory of that moment that had changed everything. He remembered how shocked he had been, then fascinated, and finally transformed by the unexpected talent of a woman he had judged insignificant. Clara observed his face while playing, seeing the genuine emotion that music awakened in him now. How he had changed, from a man who saw art only as a status symbol to someone who truly felt, truly understood music's transformative power. When the last note faded in the air, Eduardo opened his eyes, meeting Clara's gaze. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" she asked, curious. "For teaching me to listen," he replied with disarming honesty. "Not just to music, but to people, to the world, to myself." Clara smiled, touched by the depth of the response. She set the guitar gently on the chair beside her, stood up, and walked to the window. Eduardo followed her, stopping beside her to observe the city that stretched below, now dotted with evening lights. "It's strange," commented Clara after a moment, How life takes us down paths we never imagined. Eduardo nodded, thoughtful. If someone had told me 2 years ago that I'd be here now, like this, I would have laughed at the impossibility. Clara smiled, remembering the arrogance of the Eduardo she had met, the certainty he had about how life should be, about who deserved what. And now? She asked softly. Now, he replied, looking into her eyes. I can't imagine being anywhere else. Clara felt her heart accelerate with the evident sincerity in his voice. Slowly, without haste, Eduardo leaned toward her. It wasn't a predatory or possessive movement, but a silent question, an invitation she could accept or refuse. Clara closed her eyes and eliminated the distance between them. The kiss was soft, almost timid, nothing like what she would have imagined from the arrogant Eduardo of 2 years ago. It was the kiss of a man who had learned the value of gentleness, of respect, of patience. When they separated, both were smiling, not with the feverish excitement of a new romance, but with the serenity of those who find something precious after a long journey. One step at a time, murmured Clara, repeating the words from before. Eduardo nodded, gently holding her hand. No hurry, he agreed. We have time. They returned to the sofa, where Eduardo served what remained of the wine. The folder with contracts remained on the table, but it no longer seemed so urgent. There were other matters to discuss, other dreams to share. I was thinking, said Clara after a moment, about something Julia told me recently. What? Asked Eduardo, interested. She said she never imagined she could be a musician, that it seemed like an impossible dream for someone like her, until she saw someone like her doing exactly that. Eduardo nodded, understanding the power of representation, a visible example. That made me think, continued Clara, about how many other Julias exist out there. People with talent, with passion, but without access, without example, without hope. And what are you planning to do about it? Asked Eduardo, recognizing that specific gleam in her eyes, the same one that appeared whenever a new idea began to take shape. Clara smiled, appreciating how he had learned to read her so well. I'm thinking about a foundation, she replied. Something more permanent, more structured than the current project. Something that can continue even when we're no longer directly involved. Eduardo considered the idea, already calculating possibilities, structures, funding. That's what he was good at, transforming visions into concrete realities, navigating the practical world so dreams could flourish. We could start with scholarships, he suggested. Not just for classes, but for quality instruments, for trips like Julia will take, for access to masters and opportunities that would normally be out of reach. Clara nodded, enthusiastic about the suggestion, and an independent music label, she added, to record and promote talented artists who would normally be ignored by the traditional industry. They continued like this for hours, sharing ideas, refining concepts, building together the skeleton of what could become a lasting legacy. This is what they had become, partners in the best sense of the word, each bringing their unique strengths to create something greater than the sum of its parts. When Eduardo finally prepared to leave, it was past midnight. The folder with contracts was now accompanied by pages and pages of notes, sketches, plans for the future. At the door, Clara stopped him with a light touch on his arm. Eduardo, she said with a soft voice. Thank you. For what? He asked, curious. Clara smiled, thinking about how to respond. There was so much to thank him for her father's recovered guitar, for the project that changed so many lives, for the foundation they now planned, for the trip they would take together. But there was something more fundamental, more essential, for seeing beyond the uniform, she replied finally, for learning to see people, not just positions or functions. Eduardo nodded, understanding the depth of what she was saying. It wasn't just about how he had seen her that night, but about the transformation that had triggered in him, the ability to see humanity where he once saw only utility, to recognize value where he once saw only service. I'm the one who should thank you, he replied, with equal sincerity, for teaching me that dignity has no uniform. They kissed again, this time with more confidence, more certainty. When Eduardo left, Clara closed the door and returned to the living room, where the guitar waited patiently for her. She picked up the instrument, adjusting it in her lap. Her fingers found the strings by instinct, beginning to play Aurora, the hopeful new composition. But there was something different now, additional notes, richer harmonies, a complexity that didn't exist before. Music, like life, was evolving, growing, finding new ways to express itself. And Clara now was ready to follow wherever that journey might lead her, no longer hidden in shadows, no longer trapped by the past, but fully present, fully alive, fully herself. The last notes floated in the air of the silent apartment, like a promise, like a blessing. Clara smiled to herself, put away the guitar, and went to sleep, not with the resigned exhaustion of someone who merely survives, but with the satisfied serenity of someone who had finally learned to live. If this story touched your heart, remember, in every person we cross paths with, there's an entire universe waiting to be discovered. Sometimes the most beautiful music is born from the deepest silence. Leave your like and share with someone special. And comment below what city you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far our stories reach.